Well, welcome to the very Reverend William McMillan Library here in First Dunmurry. Now, at the moment, we're looking forward to the formal opening and dedication of the library, which will be at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday, the 22nd of September. And everyone is welcome. And we hope everyone will come along to that important event. The Reverend Mac bequeathed his library collection to the church, and it's a marvellous resource and something which we've been preparing to make it open to everyone who's interested, particularly in history, in the kind of history that the Reverend Mac excelled at. But as we prepare for the opening and when we're opened as well, I'm hoping to do a regular series of short videos just to introduce to everyone different parts of the collection. It's a remarkable collection. It's full of interest. And if you're interested in history, particularly in the history of the non-subscribing Presbyterian Church of Ireland and all the allied institutions that go with it, you will find this a fascinating place. So every so often, we're going to have a look at a different book or a different item in the collection. And today, I'm going to have a quick look at this book. Now, it may not look all that prepossessing. It's well over 130 years old, but it's a very, very interesting historical document. Now, this book was written by W.D. Killen, William Dule Killen, who was a Presbyterian minister. First of all, he was minister in Raphoe in County Donegal. And then later he became professor of ecclesiastical history at the Assemblies College in Belfast. And the book is entitled History of Congregations of the Presbyterian Church in Ireland and Biographical Notices of Eminent Presbyterian Ministers and Laymen. So it was one of the first attempts to write a history of congregations in the Presbyterian Church. And it was published in 1886. Now, William Dule Killen was born in Ballymena. He died, I think, in 1902, and he's buried in Balmoral Cemetery, not so very far from here. So this is an interesting book which he wrote. But the interest in this volume doesn't just end there, because this book was purchased by the Reverend Alexander Gordon, another great historian, and we can see his signature at the front of the book. Now, whereas W.D. Killen was very much a Presbyterian minister, part of the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, Alexander Gordon was a non-subscribing Presbyterian, and he was a great expert in non-subscription and non-subscribing history, on Unitarian history, and in a whole field of history much wider than that. But among many other things, Alexander Gordon was also a member in later life of Dunmurry. He was a member of this congregation, and he's buried here in our graveyard. This church meant a lot to him. But he was a foremost historian and biographer. And what he did with this book, he purchased this copy of Killen's book, and he had it disbound. And then he had it rebound, full of spaces, so he could add his own notes. And throughout the book, each congregational history is there, and interleaved in between are Gordon's own researches on that congregation. Now, prior to writing this book and other books, W.D. Killen had completed Professor J.S. Reid's History of Presbyterianism in Ireland. That's a full history of Presbyterianism in Ireland. And Mac's library has a number of copies of these 3 volumes, including this particularly attractive trio of books. And Killen finished off the 3rd volume. He wasn't always sympathetic with the non-subscribing position, but that's a view he's entitled to take. Now, Alexander Gordon is a name I will keep returning to because he was such an important figure in the study of the history of religious dissent in Ireland and in England. He was extremely knowledgeable. He contributed well over 700 entries to the Dictionary of National Biography, great Victorian attempt to record all the great names of British and Irish history. And you cannot study the history of our denomination without encountering Alexander Gordon. So we have this book written by W.D. Killen in 1886, then purchased by Alexander Gordon and rebound in 1892 for his own notes, and filled and expanded and doubled in size by Gordon's own researchers. And then, as an added bonus, of course, this book becomes the property of the Reverend William McMillan. And the Reverend Mac adds his own notes, his own interleaving, his own annotations. So we have all together in this volume the reflections and the work of three historians across over a century. So it's an incredibly useful book for anyone researching, particularly any aspect of Presbyterian history, and in particular the non-subscribing Presbyterian side of things. So almost at random, if we look here, the Antrim congregation, we have the history of Antrim as written by Killen, and then we have stuck on one of the extra pages a cutting from the Inquirer in 1894, assembled by Alexander Gordon, and listing the ministers and some details about the Antrim congregation. So this little article cut from the Inquirer in 1894 contains some very useful and interesting and unusual information. So, for instance, we can read, treasurers sometimes experience difficulty in dealing with defaulting stipend payers, of whom there were at one time 90. And so when seat rents were due on fast days, I believe, the entrance gates were closed and the doors of this significant little office were opened. And as the members filed through, they were confronted by the searching gaze of the inexorable treasurer and his assisting officials, who sat or stood behind a desk and counter with books open ready for the receipt of customs. It was doubtless a trying ordeal for those who'd fallen into arrears, and who would, if unprepared to satisfy the demands, have to be fortified with an excuse. But through they must go if they were to enter the meeting house. So that's how they collected defaulting stipend payers in the 18th century. And there's also a record to do with the celebration of communion, which tells us a lot about the way it was done in those days. Some curious entries are found in the records of this society pertaining to the communion services, which were held half yearly. 4 services were held at each communion season on Wednesday, Saturday, Sunday and Monday, the latter being a Thanksgiving service. At one of the services in 1763, there is an entry for wine amounting to 15 shillings 6pence halfpenny, and another for a bottle of rum and a glass amounting to 1 shilling 7pence halfpenny. In 1769, the entry for wine is still larger, it being 17 6 for 3 gallons. The spring of communion of 1769, we have paid for 3 gallons of wine, 17 6, for biscuit, 2.5 dozen at 3pence, 7 shillings and 6pence supply, 11 shillings 4pence halfpenny. Sexton's attendance, 6 shillings and 6pence. For brandy, 4 shillings penny halfpenny. For Mr. B's horse, 3 shillings and 3pence. So they often did also buy in some brandy or whiskey for those who had to look after all the wine as they prepared for communion. and I'm not sure who Mr. B's horse is, but the arrival of the horse cost 3 shillings and 6pence. So Gordon goes through Killen's book, adding his own notes, his own observations, and also interleaving letters, because Gordon was a very, very thorough researcher, and he wouldn't add anything to any book or any work he did without finding out exactly what happened. So here we can see, alongside the entry in Killen's book for the congregation of Westport, a letter to Alexander Gordon from John A. Crozier, the son-in-law, as it happens, of Henry Montgomery. And Crozier is answering a query from Gordon about his father, about Crozier's father's work with the Connaught mission in Westport earlier in the century. But if we look at the entry for the Dunmurry congregation, of course we can find a lot more that's of interest there. So the entry in Killen's book is actually quite short, but then we have added in material from Alexander Gordon and material from the Rev William McMillan. So we can see, for instance, 2 images of Henry Montgomery, 2 examples of carte de visite, which were very popular sort of late Victorian method, like a sort of business card, but always containing a photograph of the person. There's also a photograph taken by the Reverend Mac showing Dr. Henry Montgomery's portrait overlooking the first formal dinner in the new church hall, the McCleary Memorial Hall, opened in 1973. And behind this, we have the sermon on the death of the Reverend Thomas Hugh Marshall Scott, who was Montgomery's successor as the minister of Dunmurry, as well as notes received by Alexander Gordon. So this is really just to skim the surface of this fascinating book. But you can see just from the few examples I've picked out what a valuable record it is and how valuable it will be to people who want to study their congregational history. So if any person was investigating their own church history, they could come and have a look at this book, and they would certainly be illuminated by what they would find inside it. So this is the first of our investigations of some of the treasures of the Very Reverend William McMillan Library here in Dunmurry. But we'll keep this up as a regular venture so people can find out about some of the books and the other articles that are kept here. There are over 2,500 books and about the same number of pamphlets and all sorts of other things as well. There's a lot to look forward to, a lot to explore. So stay tuned to our talks on our library here in Dunmurry.